You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things scientific related to vertebrate pest control. Hey, hope you're doing well. I'm finally back from vacation, so I'm recording this in the first week of August, so I was able to get a number of podcasts done in advance, and so I had a good time overseas, and was really relaxing and gained a little bit too much weight. So I don't encourage people to do that, to be sure, but the food was outstanding. But nevertheless, so I hope your summer is going well. We only have a few weeks left before the kids go back to school and things start to cool off. We are in a massive heat wave here in here in Montana. So, and I guess in other parts of the country as well are struggling with drought. And of course, heat brings fire. So definitely be careful out there. All right. Well, let me make sure you know how to get a hold of me. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your thoughts, probably suggestions for future shows. Love to getting feedback from the public who are listening to this podcast. So this week, thought I would start doing a little series on striped skunks. So let me bring my PowerPoint up. So let's get started on that. Let me pull this up here. All right. Well, let's see. Let's go to... There we go. All right. Striped skunk biology. So that's what we want to make sure we're talking about here. We're just going to talk about some elements and aspects of striped skunks, because remember, there are other skunks in the United States other than striped skunks. You have the hooded skunk, you have the spotted skunk, and I guess they've broken it up into eastern spotted skunk, western spotted skunk. I have some thoughts about how they determine species in some of these cases, but nevertheless, we do have other skunks besides striped, but striped is certainly going to be has the widest distribution in the United States, and it is going to be the most common. The other skunks are definitely lower numbers, and the spotted skunk can even be it's so low and uncommon, there are concerns about that. So let's get started here on striped skunks. So one of the things I like to talk about, of course, is history, and that is people forget that skunks were highly regarded as a fur back in the day. And so there's a quote for you to read. Let me read it for those who are just listening to the podcast. It says, "Whatever we may think of the skunk, its fur is certainly worthy of high regard in which it is held by the public. Many wearers of Alaska sable and black marten furs have no suspicion that their beautiful muffs and neck pieces are made of skunk skins." And that was said by Marcus Peterson in 1914 in the publication called "The Fur Traders and Fur-Bearing Animals" by Hammond Press on page 188. And I've also included on this slide here the skunk collar that was in a 1910 ad, and there you see a lady pictured who's wearing basically a fur coat, but the collar is actually skunk fur. And this is something that people need to realize, and that is skunks sort of have a bad reputation. Of course, they have a powerful scent with their musk, but the fur is absolutely incredible, and it's unfortunate because of changing values and, of course, the rise of the animal rights protest industry, where we are not harvesting skunks sufficiently because the fur is just not considered valuable anymore, even though it is a fine fur, long-haired fur, and it's really another resource we could be using. Why? Because we want to buy petroleum for some reason, and make our furs out of fake stuff, which is definitely unfortunate. Skunks can handle a lot of harvesting, And it would be great if we got the public back to recognize the value of this particular fur. So just thought I would throw that out there. And that is, sometimes, remember, we're doing wildlife damage management. Why? Because we see the animal as a pest rather than as a resource. And that is something we need to keep in mind. So this is one of the side effects, I believe, of the animal rights protest industry, and that is the more we tend to treat animals as something that we're not allowed to harvest and use as a resource because they're so sacred or special or whatever, that means we then only treat them as a pest when they get in our way, rather than looking them as a valuable animal that should be harvested at certain times of the year, and that by itself will reduce significant numbers of problems. If I told you that, a weed in your backyard would be valuable in 3 months, what's the likelihood you're going to spray it with an herbicide today? Would you be willing to tolerate that weed for a few months if you knew you could make money off of it? Right? This is something that the public doesn't think much about. All right, let's keep going. So what are some characteristics of the striped skunk? Well, you can see there the range of weights, of course, 2.6 to 11.7 pounds is sort of the range. Males are larger than females. Total length, if you're not familiar with the term, is from the tip of the nose to the tip of the tail. And that is going to be 22 to 32 inches. And again, that striped pattern, I have a picture of a pelt there that's striped, and that would be a classic sign. But those stripes can vary dramatically. And the coloration of the skunk, so we tend to think of them as being white, but they're not necessarily. They can be a seal brown, a seal as in a water seal, that type of a seal, or it can be white as pictured here, or it can even be a yellowish color. So there can be variations in the color. Habitat, where do they like to live? Well, they prefer to live in areas that are fields dominated by grasses and forbs. Forbs are going to be flowering plants. And of course, they love structure. So why a skunk wants to build a den underneath maybe a shed, a deck, a house that has a crawl space, those are beautiful places for them to want to live. Barns would be another example. Of course, if they're having a burrow, it needs to be well drained. They're not going to burrow in a swamp, so it needs to be well drained soil. And what it would be an average density of skunks, again, whenever we start talking about how many skunks are there in a given area, that's always going to be related to food and habitat. So just keep this as sort of a rule of thumb, but don't bank on this. You're looking at about 1.7 skunks per about less than half a square mile, and kind of give you an idea about that is. But, numbers can vary depending on where you're at and how you're slicing that particular pie. And another publication pointed out that skunks prefer more open areas, and also wood snags, getting a little bit of cover. And then, of course, they like things being proximal to water. And that's partly because skunks like to eat a lot of insects. And so insects, of course, need moisture. And some of the other animals that they predate upon also like to be near water, like ground nesting birds, for example. Now, the skunk life cycle, you see this circular one, you can see that, again, this is sort of an idealized. Your exact numbers are going to vary depending on your latitude, but it's going to be kind of the same in most days, maybe off by a week or so. And this is why it's so important for you to get an understanding of what the life cycle of animals are in your particular neck of the proverbial woods, right? So this is where you're going to need to be sure you're getting this information on your own. You can ground truth it. You can also call your state wildlife biologist and try to find out in your particular state, when do these animals mate? When do they have young? Because it's going to be important for you to know when you're talking to clients, and also when you're deciding on the types of control you're going to use. Should you hold off on control so that you're not having young abandoned, or you're reducing the risk of that? or when are they going to be mating? That's also going to need to kind of get a handle on that. But generally speaking, you're looking at anywhere between mid-February to mid-March. They're going to be mating. Some areas it's going to be the end of January. So again, there's going to be some flexibility there. And then, of course, parturition, looking at May and June. The young are kind of moving around. And then, of course, they will den up, and they'll have communal dens where the young will actually den up with their mom over the winter time as well. Now, the characteristics of skunk dens, they will reoccupy abandoned dens of other animals like the woodchuck. Think of the woodchuck as the builder of dens for a particular ecosystem, and they're very important in that regard. And skunks will just go in there and just adopt that particular. Why dig when you can take over a hole that was dug by something else? Now, in terms of this research that was done in Michigan, they found the third study it looked at 36 skunk dens, and on average, they had 2 entrances. There were nests of 1.22, so probably looking at multiple occupation. And how deep did they go? Almost 40 inches. And then their length was almost 20 feet. And again, these are averages. So some are going to be smaller, some are going to be larger. And of course, they will readopt woodchuck dens. Now, where do they like to den? Well, they like to den under structures. That's going to be over 50%. And again, this idea of them using a structure because it's going to give them a lot of shelter from weather conditions, rain conditions, and they can just simply burrow underneath and get into that crawl space area and then dig another den on the underneath it, or they can take over a burrow for some other animal. So they like that kind of protection. They also will take over burrows, as we've already mentioned, or dig burrows. And again, when they mention burrows here, they're referring to burrows away from structures. And then lastly, sometimes they'll just live in dense debris, and that was only about 13% were in dense vegetation. Sometimes in the summertime, skunks will just simply lay out on the grass out in the middle of the field when they're hunting around, because it's certainly warm enough, and they just simply hang out in a particular area. Now, in terms of their underground dens, when are they living? Well, fall to spring, and they will communal den. So you can have more than one skunk inside of that particular den. And when are they active? Well, anything basically above negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, why is that important? Because if the ground gets too hard, they're going to basically den up, because they like to forage into the ground looking for insects, for example. So if the ground is too hard for all that, they're not going to be out foraging around. And so you say, well, but the ground can freeze at 0. Yeah, but think of it more in terms of how long how cold it has been and for a sufficient length of time. So if it's been below 0 for several weeks, probably the skunks are going to be denning up at that particular time. But typically in the winter, you'll have something really cold, and then it will kind of warm up. You have a thaw, and then it will get cold again, thaw, and so skunks will take advantage of those thawing periods. Now, in terms of their winter denning practices, the rule of thumb is the higher the latitude, in other words, the closer you're getting to the North Pole, the longer they're in the den. And so you can see some data here in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Those of you up in Canada, they'll be in the dens about less than 150 days. But if you're in Minnesota, it drops down to 135. Illinois, which gets farther south still, 87 days. And then in southern Illinois, it gets down to 59 days. And so you can just see how the numbers just keep dropping the farther you get down closer toward the equator, and so this is why it's so important for you to know what skunks are doing in your particular neck of the woods, as I've said before. Skunks in the winter, and this kind of surprised me a little bit. I'm not sure I was really ready really knew this when I was doing my reading, and that is that they will use multiple dens in the wintertime. And so, on average, they will use a den for about 4 days in a row, but they will use dens for longer periods, sometimes 28 days, 39 days, 59 days in a row. So, again, it's going to vary. And so one of the things I like to remind people at, you have to be careful of absolutes when we're dealing with wildlife, because animals, like people, can be different. So one of the analogies I use, and that is when we talk about these tendencies in animals, what we're looking at is an average. But you could always have to think about that one skunk that may be like your crazy uncle. It's like your crazy uncle is still a person, but he is different from everybody else, and so he's going to break the average. So he's going to be an outlier. Well, there's always going to be the chance of some outliers. So when we're looking at this type of data, you always have to remember that your particular encounter with an animal can be different, but we're looking for tendencies, right? And these can be important because the majority of your jobs are going to be just simply normal. Same thing, different day. But on occasion, you as a professional, or if you're a homeowner listening to this, welcome aboard, understand that there are sometimes there's going to be that the animal's going to act a little bit differently. And so this is why there needs to be some tentativeness when we're dealing with some of these averages and comments. When are they mating? Well, just a reminder, mid-February to mid-April. Notice it's a longer period of time than the circle I gave you before, because that circle came from a particular publication. Skunks are promiscuous, which means that the males are going to be out trying to mate with multiple females. And I believe, if memory serves, females will sometimes be mated by more than one male. But typically it's the male that's the most promiscuous. Males are going to be doing some serious searching during the mating season, right? So they will move up to almost 2 miles in a night in search of females that are in heat. Females during the mating season, if they don't like the male, they're going to spray him. If he doesn't get the hint, they're going to spray him. This is why many people discover the presence of skunks underneath the deck in the wintertime, because they said they didn't know anything about the skunk being there, but mating season comes along and there's a spray, right? And so this is what happened. This is a very common thing to occur. In terms of reproduction, how much do they have? Well, females can have anywhere from 6 to 8 young. And notice how long gestation is. You're looking at about 2 months, actually up to 77 days. So that's a long time. We're looking at what, 10 weeks, up to 10 weeks, give or take. So we are looking at a significant amount of time for her to have young. And during that period of time, she will restrict her movement 1 to 2 weeks after whelping. In other words, so that's something she's going to hang around. When she gives birth, she's going to hang around a little bit. So keep that in mind as well. So this is where you need to try to figure out when mating season is, and then when is she going to have those young? Because you're going to be having to think about, when you're trapping her, is the likelihood of having abandoned young as well. Now, in the wintertime, skunks suffer a great deal of weight loss, which certainly makes sense. Now, obviously, skunks in the summer, in the southern areas, not the summer, in the southern areas of the country, aren't going to necessarily have this particular problem, because they're able to forage year-round, right? We're talking about skunks in the more colder areas of the country, up into Canada as well, where you're looking at where they have snow and freezing rain and this sort of thing. So males can suffer up to half weight loss, as well as females. So females are going to lose a lot more weight over the winter, which certainly makes sense, because usually they're going to get pregnant, and they're going to be not as they have to put a lot more resources into reproduction. Skunks are insect driven, so they will den up during harsh weather. So if you have a situation where a client needs to have you control some skunks and the weather, you're looking at the weather report and it's looking like it's going to get freezing cold, you might just want to wire your traps open there for a while because you're not really going to do a whole lot of work. You may be able to do a lot of action before that front hits, but once that front hits, there's not going to be a whole lot of things going on. If the ground is frozen, too frozen to dig in, they're not really going to move, as I've said before. Now, the last few slides here comes from a publication that talked about scent marking and where the researchers actually believe that they've demonstrated that skunks scent mark. Now, those of you involved in control of predators, for example, or perhaps you have a dog or a cat, animals like to mark their area with the scent. So you think cats will have scent glands on their head and they'll rub things. It's kind of like I own you or you're mine. Dogs will do the same thing. Deer will do the same thing as well. Well, the question is whether skunks did this sort of thing. And there was some work being done, and they found that they believe that they found evidence that skunks do mark. And what you're looking at here is a chart showing when that scent marking is occurring. Now look at January. Now January looks like it's going to be like prior or during mating season, right? So seems that there's some sort of relationship there. And then you look at something in April, like what is that all about? What's going on in April? Don't know, right? So this is where they use the trail cameras and they're trying to figure out what the skunks are doing. And what they found was that most what they perceived to be marking was occurring primarily in the morning. Now, what are the types of marking that the skunks were doing or what the researchers thought they were doing? So cheek rubbing was number one. So that's where they're rubbing up against an object with their cheek. What they called investigating, probably sniffing around something, claw marking, shaking, and body rubbing. And then it starts going down from that particular point. So cheek rubbing would be certainly the most significant one. The most common one. Now you may say, Stephen, why are you telling me this? Well, my suspicion is I want you just to be aware of that this can occur and that now you know that this is a possibility. How can you, as a wildlife control professional, exploit this? So one of the questions that I'm asking is, with scent marking, are there particular trapping sets that you may be able to think about to use to exploit this particular behavior? One of the challenges for trapping is that when you're trapping, you want to make sure your trap is targeted to the animal that you want to capture. And that can be difficult sometimes in a chaotic nature of trapping and out in where you don't know what animals are going to be coming along, lured by whatever bait you're using. Perhaps you're in a trail, don't know what necessarily, because the animals will use each other's trails as well. So it's going to be very hard. So, but if you know that skunks are going to be scent marking, and now that you're able to observe this, those of you doing a lot of skunk work, perhaps, you may be able to think of, hey, am I able to maybe do a post set where there's no bait per se, but maybe there's just sort of a vertical pole that I may be able to exploit. Now we have a lot more trail cameras being used in the industry. Perhaps you're able to evaluate where that activity is and place a trap where that skunk is, where you believe it's going to be scent marking. Perhaps there may be a lure that may exploit the idea of scent marking. So I'll just throw it out there. Some of you are pretty clever, and it may be a way for you to really think about how you can target skunks better and more efficiently, so then that can increase your profit margin. Because as I've said in so many other podcasts, if you're doing what everyone else is doing, how do you have a competitive edge? You simply don't. So other things that, just to remind you about this particular podcast that we've covered. Number one, remember that coloration among striped skunks can vary dramatically from like tan brown to yellow to white in terms of those stripes. The stripes can be thick, narrow, and almost non-existent, right, in terms of if you're looking quickly at them. Keep in mind as well that skunk activity is tied to temperature. So in the wintertime, if the ground's too hard, they're not really going to be moving. If you get into this really freezing cold spell, the skunks are not going to be moving. So make sure you are making plans and your control efforts in accordance with that, because otherwise you're going to be wasting a lot of time. Well, that's it for this week in terms of talking about skunks. We'll have another podcast about skunk activity or striped skunk activity next week. So come back and stay tuned. Do take a few moments, if you would, to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd certainly be grateful for that. And again, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, perhaps you'd like to be on the show, maybe you have a product that you'd like to have on, or perhaps you think could be a manufacturer that you'd like us to reach out to, we'd love to contact them. We love having people that do make products or provide services to the industry and interview them so that we can get the word out to others in our industry. You can want to reach out to me. You can do that through wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Thoughts, suggestions for future shows, and yes, even criticisms, but provided they're going to be substantive. Appreciate that. All right. Well, that's it for this week. Be safe out there. Take care, everybody.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.